Commander Xerxes of the interstellar infiltration fleet peered through the visor of his 6-inch tall micro-combat armor, absolutely certain that this sprawling wasteland of colossal metallic wreckage was the perfect covert staging ground to establish the Earth Annihilation Communications Relay. He had just smugly ordered his 50 elite operatives to activate the high-intensity red laser sights on their microplasma rifles, preparing to sever a massive black cable thicker than his own waist. However, on a micro scale, those 50-plus lethal red beams instantly awakened a dormant menace. Over 200 feral stray cats, bored out of their minds in this Detroit junkyard. Over by a rusted Ford pickup, night watchman Old Jim was taking a leak, a beat-up Remington shotgun tucked under his arm. Hearing the rustling, he zipped up and growled, "Goddamn feral cats. What in the hell are y'all freaking out over now? Chasing mutant rats again." Xerxes' high-dimensional tactical radar shrieked with collision alarms. More than 100 pairs of massive glowing green eyes suddenly ignited atop the rusted car roofs surrounding them. A mountain-sized, one-eared orange tabby let out a guttural yowl, its colossal furry shadow instantly swallowing the alien squad whole. The IF, Identify Friend/Foe system on Xerxes' armor literally fried itself, spitting out a plume of black smoke. He slammed his fist into his wrist-mounted tactical display, shattering the pop-up notification that had previously classified Earth's native fauna as zero tactical threat. A microsecond later, his pupils pinned back to mere dots. That giant one-eared orange feline coiled its muscles tight, its toe beans scraping a harsh, screeching metallic wail against the rusted iron. It launched itself straight off the 10-foot roof of a scrapped sedan. The beast's furry, mountain-like mass completely blotted out the moonlight over the entire engine block. The dancing red laser dot from the frontline soldier's rifle happened to land dead center on its powder-pink nose. This 15-pound apex predator didn't even blink. It just flattened its posture and lunged relentlessly toward the light. Xerxes' comms channel immediately choked with the frantic, staticky screams of his recruits. He kicked a rusted bolt, half as big as his entire body and twice as heavy, sending it flying. The bolt struck the hood, sparking violently as his voice cracked in a desperate roar that drowned out the noise. All units. Maximize energy shield thresholds immediately. Maximum defensive protocols engage. 50 micro-combat suits whined with a high-frequency hum as pale blue spherical shields popped open one by one. The 50 glowing orbs crowded together on the cramped platform of the car hood, linking up to form an impenetrable wall of hard light defense. Xerxes gripped his microplasma rifle, his knuckles turning white. He had fought in 7 interstellar campaigns. This shield array could tank a direct hit from a low-orbit anti-ship laser for 3 seconds straight. There was zero statistical probability of it being breached by this ball of furry carbon-based trash. The wind suddenly reeked of copper and raw meat. The colossal shadow of the orange tabby, radiating the stifling heat of a mammal, utterly eclipsed the blue tactical glow. The sheer aerodynamic wake of the descending giant paw slammed Xerxes' visor brutally into his chest console. On his tactical HUD, every single blue column representing the micro-shield's integrity plummeted at a terrifying, visible rate. A massive 15-pound paw, armed with heavily calloused toe beans, slammed dead center onto the alloy engine hood right in the middle of their formation. Thud. The half-inch thick steel plate instantly caved in, cratering under the blunt force impact. The shield generators of the 10 elite infiltrators standing at ground zero didn't even manage a half-millisecond overload warning. They simply detonated into a shower of fine blue and white sparks. The soldiers were swatted sideways like glass marbles struck by a sledgehammer, violently launching into the depths of a waist-high tire stack 10 feet away, leaving behind only a few stray pieces of shrapnel rolling on the ground. The wind generated by the strike sent Xerxes' hoverpack into violent tremors. He staggered back 3 steps, his boot treads carving 3 ear-piercing white gouges into the rusted steel plate before he barely managed to stabilize. He scanned his remaining 40 men. They were pale as ghosts, gripping their rifles with bone-white knuckles. A cacophony of armor alarms bled together into a deafening siren that threatened to rupture their eardrums. The one-eared orange cat lifted its right paw, temporarily numbed by the strike, and lazily licked the rust flakes off its toe beans. Its amber, slit pupil eyes swiveled down, precisely locking onto the paralyzed Xerxes and the remnants of his shattered squad. Xerxes ground his back teeth together so hard they clicked. He whipped his microplasma rifle to his chest, his finger locked tight inside the freezing trigger guard. His raspy command blasted through the suit's overloading feedback whine. Open fire. All units, open fire. 40 microplasma rifles discharged simultaneously. Hair-thin streaks of blue plasma erupted from the barrels, painting fleeting pale lines against the frigid midnight air. These lethal beams, which could effortlessly melt through 4 inches of titanium on the homeworld firing range, swept across the thick orange back of the tabby. They managed to singe off a few loose hairs. A faint smell of burnt cat fur drifted up, and the 15-pound behemoth simply flicked its tail in annoyance, not yielding a single inch of ground. Panic consumed the soldiers. They clamped down on their triggers, refusing to let go. The frantically jerking muzzles threw dozens of bright red laser dots wildly into the air, skipping across rusted hoods and sweeping over dust-caked windshields like a dozen crazed laser pointers scribbling haphazardly across the junkyard. The very next second, over 200 feral cats perched on car roofs, draped over tire stacks, and wedged in engine blocks, simultaneously stiffened their spines. A hunting instinct hard-coded into their DNA completely overrode everything else. Every pair of amber and emerald slit eyes locked instantly onto those erratic, dancing red dots. The muffled thuds of toe beans hitting rusted metal blended into a singular rolling thunder, crushing in on Xerxes' squad from all sides. Old Jim chewed on a crumpled Camel cigarette, the soles of his work boots crunching loudly over broken glass as he cursed and waded through ankle-deep metal scraps. The half-empty bottle of bourbon in the back pocket of his cargo pants clinked rhythmically against his thigh. His other hand gripped a heavy-duty tactical flashlight cranked to max power, the blinding beam sweeping over the rusted peaks of the car mountains, stabbing straight toward the chaotic noise. Did these little shits chug motor oil tonight, or what? Causing such a damn racket I can't even hear the precinct dispatch. He kicked a 1967 Chevy hubcap out of his way, sending it flying 10 feet. The metallic clang against an engine block startled 3 sparrows off a car roof. If it's some punk-ass car thieves sneaking in, this here Remington ain't gonna play by Detroit rules. Without warning, the flashlight's beam washed entirely over the alien squad's position. 41 micro-combat suits, all running in maximum night vision mode, instantly overloaded. The optical sensors in their visors cooked off in tiny bursts of black smoke. The alien soldiers, who had been waving their plasma rifles around, let out a collective, agonizing shriek. They clutched their eyes, rolling blindly in the rust and grit. Several of them accidentally triggered their hoverpack ignitions, the thrusters sputtering out errant sparks. Even Xerxes, standing dead center, was blinded so severely he stumbled backward 3 steps, nearly plunging into an empty bolt hole. Old Jim scratched his messy white hair, sweeping the flashlight over the area twice more. All he saw was a bunch of jittery red dots, figuring it was just some laser pointer toys dropped by those bratty kids camping out last week. He pursed his lips, ready to head back to the guard shack, the pull tab of the tuna can sticking out of his pocket, giving a soft ding as he moved. More than 20 feral stray cats, muscles coiled to the absolute limit, lifted their toe beans off the ground. Razor-sharp claws extended a half-inch out of their sheaths, less than 2 inches away from the backs of the blinded, flailing alien soldiers. White afterimages seared by the high-intensity light still burned behind Xerxes's visor. The suit's optical modules sizzled, leaking acrid black smoke. He couldn't even see his own hand stretched out in front of him. His earpiece was flooded with the lung-shredding screams of his subordinates, underpinned by the sickening soft scrape of feral cat toe beans against rust, a sound less than an inch from the back of his neck. He furiously slammed his helmet against his wrist tactical console, making the indicator lights spasm, and blasted a hoarse roar across the open frequency. All units with functional hover packs ascend immediately. The remaining 20 will lay down suppressive fire. No one hesitated. 20 fingers smashed down on their hover pack ignition switches almost simultaneously. Ragged, blue-white exhaust plumes instantly rocketed up from the rust-covered ground. A few panicked soldiers cranked the thrust too high, whizzing straight past the tabby's ear. A sweeping cat claw sheared off half a pauldron, sending the soldier spinning out of control a foot in the air before barely stabilizing. 26-inch tall figures hovered erratically 10 feet above the ground, batted around violently by the midnight Detroit wind. They jammed their control sticks forward with everything they had, rushing toward a rusted crane, boom, 30 yards away. The red laser dots from their rifles swept wildly across the ground behind them, immediately triggering a frenzy among the cats surrounding the 20 grounded soldiers. Over a dozen cats leaped 3 feet into the air, chasing the dots straight toward the sky. Xerxes braced his armor against a protruding, rusted bolt, his eyes bulging beneath his visor. He stared intently at those wobbly points of light struggling toward the high ground, even noting that the lead soldier's exhaust vent was still leaking sparks. The 20 micro-figures, trailing pale blue exhaust, hadn't managed a single second of stable flight before they entered the exact airspace about to be swept by that blindingly white flashlight beam. Old Jim, knuckles stained with semi-dry motor oil, gave his wrist a casual flick. The stark white beam nailed the chaotic cloud of pale blue exhaust trails dead to rights. He squinted his aging eyes upward, kicking aside a scrap bolt in his way while cussing, "The hell kind of Detroit summer breeds blue glowing horseflies." Before the words even left his mouth, a pure black feral cat perched on the roof of a scrapped Chevy 3 yards away snapped its hind legs straight. The black shadow launched into the air like a lead slug out of a shotgun. The wind howling off its swinging paw had barely grazed the air when a dull smack rang out. The first wildly weaving alien soldier was swatted straight into the ankle-deep muck by Jim's boots, showering fine metallic sparks upon impact. The hundreds of feral cats crouched on car roofs, hoods, and tire stacks erupted in absolute chaos. They had already registered these glowing, floating trinkets as the juiciest, most vibrant prey. One by one, they arched their backs and launched into the sky, their movements as practiced as if they spent every single day in the junkyard doing aerial bird-catching drills. Glossy toe beans swung with hurricane force, swiping vertically and horizontally. Every time a paw connected, it delivered a sickening, muffled thud. 15 pale blue exhaust trails vanished into the mud, one after the other. The alien soldiers were battered so senseless that their screams caught in their throats as they were driven half an inch deep into the black, oily sludge. The last 5 guys, hoverpacks spewing black smoke, scrambled and rolled, burning their absolute final fumes to dodge the tabby's incoming claw swipe. They slammed hard into the derelict crane boom dozens of feet up, desperately clinging to the rusted weld seams just to keep from falling. Old Jim scratched the back of his head, now covered in cat hair. The tabby rubbed affectionately against his cargo pants, making the half bottle of bourbon clink loudly. Jim didn't even bother glancing up at the crane, just swept his flashlight across the ground to see what kind of fresh nonsense the cats had swatted down this time. Up in the shadows of the crane boom, the 5 surviving alien soldiers didn't even have time to check their armor for dents. Panicking, they unspooled encrypted communicators from their backs and slapped them onto the metal surface, their fingertips already depressing the SOOS transmission keys. None of them heard it on the freezing steel cable right behind them. Soft pink toe beans had already silently stepped onto the first crossbeam. Xerxes's tactical holographic display suddenly exploded into a blinding flurry of static. The 5 bright red dots representing the elite infiltration soldiers on the crane boom, which had just transmitted a half-second of coordinate data, were violently extinguished into dead gray within a tenth of a second. His white-knuckled command blade clattered into the rust dust at his feet. In his field of vision, with all night vision components completely burned out by the flash, nothing remained but a twitching mess of afterimages. The final 5 distorted screams on the comms channel crackled out into static. They hadn't even managed to broadcast a fraction of their hyperspace distress signal. The 20 blinded soldiers, still on the ground with him, froze in absolute terror. Their microplasma rifles shook uncontrollably in their hands. The red laser sights jerking from the muzzles swept wildly over puddles of waste oil, shattered glass, and rusted sheet metal. With every erratic sweep, the low, rumbling purrs of the surrounding felines deepened ominously. One soldier's hover pack suddenly malfunctioned, shooting out a half-inch jet of flame. Terrified, the soldier ripped the pack off and hurled it away. It smashed into an empty aluminum can with a sharp clatter that rolled agonizingly far into the dead silence of the junkyard. Xerxes's shield generator shrieked a high-pitched overload alarm. The tactical sensors on the back of his neck detected massive shadows radiating the warm, suffocating presence of living, breathing monsters closing in from all directions. The muffled thuds of 15-pound furry predators stepping on scrap metal slammed into his audio receivers like a sledgehammer. Even from several yards away, he could smell the grotesque stench of canned tuna, mixed with motor oil clinging to their fur. All external communication frequencies had completely devolved into meaningless static noise. He couldn't grasp even a phantom trace of a response signal from the mothership. He kicked aside half of a rusted brake pad blocking his path. The roar tearing from his throat was laced with a violent tremor, as every remaining shred of his tactical logic screamed for him to find an absolute bunker, a place where he could seal off every conceivable gap. Xerxes's tactical boots sent a chunk of crumbling rust flying as he staggered forward, practically crawling in desperation. In the suit's residual thermal imaging, the dark, heavy V8 engine block of the Chevy 3 yards ahead looked like the ultimate lifeline. Behind him, the 20 blinded soldiers shoved and trampled each other. Someone slipped in an oil puddle, going down with a bizarre shriek. Another misfired in panic. The red laser dot skipped across the rusted metal in a flurry of sparks, which only served to tighten the noose of the hunter's attention. Xerxes threw punches, knocking aside 2 soldiers in his way, and was the first to dive headfirst into an open cylinder bore. The rough, rusted interior scraped against his micro-armor, throwing off a cascade of electrical sparks. The soldiers right behind him crammed themselves into the narrow cavity like sardines, the sharp clatter of colliding metal echoing relentlessly as a dropped microplasma rifle tumbled down the cylinder wall to his feet. Xerxes backed hard against the freezing cylinder wall, gasping for air. Reaching back, he dragged a loose, rusted iron plate over to heavily barricade the majority of the opening. His fingertips were still spasming violently. He was already beginning to calculate how, once the furry menace outside dispersed, he'd lead the remnants to the chain-link perimeter to find a breach. But at that precise moment, his suit's sensors erupted into a blindingly red critical alarm. The dense, rhythmic tapping of toe beams against the engine's metal casing drilled straight into his skull. Dozens of warm thermal signatures instantly saturated the sensor's peripheral view, swarming the entire engine block tight. The moment Xerxes' residual vibration sensors registered the tickling sensation of whiskers sweeping against the exterior of his helmet, he froze solid like stone. Before he could order a defensive contraction, a pink toe beam coated in rust dust squeezed through a gap in the left exhaust manifold. With a sharp click, a razor-sharp hooked claw dug right into the shoulder seam of a blinded soldier's micro-armor next to him. The soldier didn't even have time to squeak out a scream before brute force yanked him backward through the gap, his high tensile alloy shell screeching a trail of electric sparks against the rusted metal. Instantly, metallic scraping noises exploded from every direction inside the cylinder. Cylinder bores, bolt holes, seams, any crevice wide enough to fit a fingertip was suddenly invaded by a warm feline claw. These paws were as pliable as melted asphalt, snaking their way effortlessly through the corrugated bulkheads, completely unbothered by the confined space. The remaining blind soldiers fired their microplasma rifles blindly, but the pale blue beams failed to leave so much as a scorch mark on the cat's thick fur. Instead, the erratic red laser sights pushed the cat's hunting drive into overdrive, increasing the force of the claws hooking into armor seams by another 30%. One soldier was snagged by the strap of his hoverpack and yanked out the top of the bore like a grasshopper on a string. Another, cowering behind the crankshaft, tried to burrow deeper, only for a claw to snake through the crankshaft gap, grab him by the ankle, and drag him out backward. The muffled thuds of paws batting their prey echoed against the exterior walls, every single strike shaking a cascade of metal shavings down into the cylinder. Xerxes dug his knuckles into a rusted pit in the cylinder wall, his armor scored with deep gouges from razor-sharp nails. He counted the screams of his men disappearing one by one. When the final agonizing wail of the last dragged-away soldier faded, the vibration sensors showed that, aside from him, there were only 5 living humans left inside the engine, shaking like leaves. From outside the cylinder wall came the deep, rumbling purr of the one-eared tabby. The vibration resonated so powerfully, it made the entire Chevy V8 hum and rattle. A furry, orange feline face had already shoved halfway into the top intake port, its hot, damp breath pouring down into the cavity. Just as Xerxes lunged for the dropped microplasma rifle at his feet, the heavy clunk of boots crushing scrap metal bore down on them from 10 yards away, heading straight in their direction. The rubber soles of old Jim's boots ground over shredded sheet metal, firing off a staccato of loud clangs. The unlit cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth was damp with night dew. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose, grumbling a non-stop stream of curses. Did these little shits chug motor oil tonight or what? Ruckus is crazier than when that scrap hauler flipped on its side last week. The bulging half bottle of bourbon in his waistband dug painfully into his kidney. He gripped the tactical flashlight, its beam sweeping through the gaps in the car piles without catching a single rat's shadow. He navigated the jagged, rusted spikes jutting from the ground with practiced ease, a route head walked for 10 years, one he could traverse blindfolded without scuffing his boots. As he stepped up to that Chevy V8 engine block, a severely rusted hubcap slid out from under a pile of scrap and caught the treads of his boot, making him stumble. Son of a bitch, junk-ass scrap, old Jim spat. He raised his heavy-duty work boot and delivered a vicious kick to the hubcap. Clang! The half-inch thick iron plate sailed like a frisbee, smashing violently into the door of a totaled pickup truck nearby. The impact shook loose a heavy downpour of rust flakes. The 20-plus feral cats swarming the engine's crevices, digging away with unbridled enthusiasm, instantly flattened their ears against their skulls. Even the big tabby, whose massive orange head was wedged halfway down the intake, violently yanked himself back. Every single cat snapped their head toward the source of the noise, completely halting their clawing. Old Jim rattled the tuna can head pulled from his pocket. The tin clattered loudly. He let out a piercing whistle. "Whatry y'all huddled up for? Chow time's comin'. Don't get your panties in a bunch." The aftershocks of the ear-splitting metallic crash were still buzzing through the engine's hollow cavities when the swarm of cats blocking all the exits receded a half-foot back like a receding tide. Xerxes pressed himself flat against the rust-mottled cylinder wall. The bone-chilling scrape of cat claws, which just a second ago was crystal clear, vanished without a trace. He violently ripped a half-strand of cat hair wedged in his visor's seam. His knuckles were pale with force, and the microplasma rifle in his grip was drenched in nervous sweat from holding it so tight. He threw a heavy punch at the shoulder blade of the shivering, blinded soldier next to him. The voice grinding out of his throat, mixed with the suit's feedback hum, was dangerously fractured, full-speed breakout. Now. The 6 heavily damaged micro-combat suits scrambled and clawed their way toward the rusted-out oil drain hole at the bottom of the block. The jagged burrs around the edges dragged across armor, already heavily scored by cat claws, violently ripping off a massive chunk of exterior plating with a screech. Xerxes squeezed through the coin-width hole first. The freezing night wind slapped against his overheating visor. His failing optical sensors caught the blurry silhouette of a chain-link fence 30 yards out. If they could just sprint across this debris-filled no-man's land, they could reach the emergency extraction beacon pre-stashed in the drainage ditch. Nobody dared to engage what little power remained in their hover packs. Everyone throttled down to absolute minimums, sprinting for their lives across the crushed glass. The pale blue coolant leaking from their suits dragged 6 crooked, glowing trails behind them. Leading the charge, Xerxes dedicated every last drop of his tactical processing power to dodging grains of sand that were large enough to trip them. He could even hear the distinct rattle of the wind hitting the chain-link fence in the distance. He clenched his fists, putting everything he had into lifting his leg for the final bound. His heavy tactical boot plunged downward with all his forward momentum, but the sole of his boot didn't hit the anticipated gritty texture of metal slag. Instead, it struck a pool of viscous waste oil, slick as black ice. Traction flatlined to 0 upon impact. Unable to check his forward momentum, he pitched forward violently, like a puppet with its strings cut. The knees of his armor smashed into the oil slick with a hollow clunk, kicking up a massive spray of dark, shimmering sludge. The 5 blinded soldiers following him couldn't see the terrain at all. They stepped squarely into his exact landing zone, one by one. 6 6-inch tall microsuits sequentially flipped sideways and fell flat on their backs, flailing their legs pointlessly in the thick grime like turtles flipped onto their shells. Someone's microplasma rifle slipped from their grip and skidded a foot and a half away, the barrel drowning in black oil, the trigger guard jamming tight into a crack in a rusted plate. Another soldier kicked so frantically, he launched his own tactical boot completely off. His bare metallic foot couldn't find a single purchase on the slick surface. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the sludge. Everyone desperately held down their hoverpack ignition switches, absolutely terrified to throttle up, fearing the backwash from a half-power thruster would flip them straight into the deepest part of the oil pit. Large patches of stripped exterior armor were now caked in sticky, foul waste oil, and even the simple rotation of their arm joints began emitting strained, stiff squeaks. Xerxes strained to lift his chin, desperately trying to keep the suffocating stench of oil from seeping into his visor seams. His oil-slicked fingers frantically slapped at his control panel, but every command vanished into the void. All he got in return was the endless, shrieking overload alarm in his earpiece. Suddenly, his tactical audio pickup caught a devastatingly clear sound, the soft, squishy patter of toe beans crunching over metal slag. The sound advanced slowly, unhurriedly, every single footfall stomping with pinpoint precision on his rapidly fraying nerves. The wind, carrying the stench of waste oil and sun-baked rust, suddenly died. A colossal shadow, following the reflection of the oil puddle, inched over their 6 paralyzed bodies, swallowing them whole. Xerxes looked up. Through the observation port smeared with black sludge, he locked eyes directly with the tabby's vertical pupils, glowing like twin yellow incandescent bulbs. The 15-pound behemoth's paw descended lazily, stopping less than 2 inches above his command helmet. Every single megabyte of knowledge regarding interstellar infiltration tactics and civilizational supremacy was instantly wiped from his brain, leaving nothing but absolute, borderline psychotic collapse. He reached his sticky, oil-covered fingers to his chest and dug violently into the safety pin of his sidearm microplasma grenade. Putting every ounce of his remaining strength into it, he bent the metal clasp out of shape. With a sharp snap, the safety pin popped off and dropped into the oil puddle. Sensing the approaching heat signature, a terrified soldier next to him accidentally discharged his microplasma rifle. The feeble blue plasma beam struck the cat right on the tip of the nose. It didn't scorch a single hair, but it did make the orange tabby tilt its head in amusement, raising a paw to swat at this pile of tiny iron mice thrashing about in the muck. The very last shred of Xerxes' dignity as a galactic fleet commander shattered into dust. Screaming hysterically, he rerouted the sparking, overloaded energy core of his combat suit directly into the grenade's detonation circuit. A blinding plasma light erupted in the palm of his hand. The shock wave pushed outward, kicking up a fine mist of black oil droplets as he poured his very last ounce of strength into slamming the detonator button. Old Jim's boot ground over a rusted-out Chevy door panel, grinding off a layer of red rust with a loud screech. His other hand kept the high-powered flashlight sweeping through the scrap piles. A Camel cigarette burned down to the filter pinched between his knuckles. Suddenly, a muffled pop, as faint as a damp lighter sparking, drifted from behind him, almost entirely drowned out by the rolling chorus of 200 feral cats purring. Furrowing his graying brows, he turned and swept the flashlight back. The beam nailed a decade-old waste oil puddle. Splatters of black oil rained down on the tabby's thick orange back. The 15-pound titan merely flicked its ears, followed by an earth-shattering sneeze that echoed down the entire scrap alley. The tuft of hair on its nose, already curled by the plasma beam, shed 2 loose strands. The tabby shook his oil-slicked whiskers. His toe beans smacked down onto the bubbling surface of the oil puddle. Dipping his head down, his razor-sharp canines expertly clamped onto the helmet seam of Xerxes' armor. With one swipe of his tongue, he scooped up the other 5 blinded alien soldiers, men, guns and all, straight into his mouth as they thrashed blindly in the grease. Old Jim laughed around his cigarette, kicking an empty beer can on the road like it was nothing. "I see you, you fat bastard, hogging all the snacks tonight. You ain't getting any of this canned stuff later, you hear?" The cat completely ignored the threat. Tail hoisted straight up like an orange flagpole, he took heavy, steady strides toward the guard shack. His sharp fangs unconsciously tightened their grip, biting firmly into the outer alloy plating of the micro-combat armor. The very first thing Xerxes registered as consciousness returned was a soul-crushing, agonizing pain radiating through his back. The microplasma grenade he had given everything to detonate hadn't even singed a single stray hair on the orange tabby. Instead, the blast recoil had propelled him directly into the cat's half-open maw. The outer alloy of the micro-armor slammed brutally against the canines. The high-pitched screech of metal on the verge of shattering drilled through his skeletal seams straight into his brain. Every red alarm on his suit's central console flashed to maximum brightness instantly, the shrill feedback whining so loud it physically tore at his eardrums. Viscous, transparent cat saliva, reeking heavily of tuna, seeped through his visor gaps, completely gumming up the majority of his tactical HUD. He tried to lift his hand to draw the side-mounted microplasma rifle, but the second he moved a finger, his entire body was violently jolted by the cat's gait. The sickening sensation of weightlessness shot straight up his spine into his skull. He scanned his peripheral vision and saw his 5 direct subordinates crammed in beside him. Several of their microsuits were already severely dented by the cat's sharp teeth. The red laser sights from their rifles jerked uncontrollably, painting the orange fuzz lining the oral cavity with erratic splashes of light. Every single long-range comms frequency was drowned in vicious static. The maximum priority SAW signal pre-programmed for the mothership couldn't even broadcast a 1.5 feet before being utterly blocked by the dense layer of cat fur. Zerk's Ix hammered wildly at his control panel. Even when he split a fingernail, he couldn't pull up a fraction of a % of shield energy. The moment those cat claws had swatted the outside of the engine block, the entire energy reserve brought by the fleet had already overloaded by 2/3. The cat gave his head a gentle shake to flick off the gross motor oil. Zerk's world spun violently. The crack in his shoulder, pauldron immediately widened by another 1/2 inch. The frigid midnight Detroit wind sliced through the exposed gaps in his shattered armor. In the blur, he saw the dim yellow light of the guard shack rapidly approaching, while the ground of the junkyard beneath them vibrated subtly with every single step the orange cat took. Just as his final shred of consciousness attempted to form the thought, "When will the mothership receive my coordinates?" An overwhelming wave of dizziness seized his nervous system. Zerk's eyes rolled back, and he passed out cold, rigid as a board. The tabby took confident steps past the tin cat food bowl by the threshold, flicking his tail in triumph. Carefully, he deposited his mouthful of tiny metal men onto the cool wooden steps of the porch, lining them up one by one. 51 drool-covered, heavily tooth-dented, battered micro-combat suits sat in a perfectly neat row. Old Jim tucked the last quarter bottle of bourbon under his armpit. The back of his neck caught the chill of the early morning Michigan dew, and he let out a massive yawn that reeked of heavy liquor. He had just finished his 3rd patrol around the 300-acre mountain of scrap without spotting so much as a shadow of a catalytic converter stealing tweak, only managing to scrounge up 1/2 pack of wind-blown menthols. He was fully prepared to hole up on the beat-up sofa inside the shack and catch up on some sleep. His work boots crunched over shattered glass and rusted iron, loudly punting an empty oil drum out of the way. As his sole scraped against the first wooden plank of the porch, he stepped right into a thick, sticky puddle of cat spit. Jim mumbled half a curse, looking up to see the one-eared orange giant perched boldly at the top of the stairs. The cat's tail stood tall like a flag of victory, and there was still a smudge of black motor oil on his forehead. Lined up perfectly at the cat's feet were 51 metal figurines, barely the length of a palm, sparking with defective blue-purple arcs of electricity. Every single shell was riddled with cat bites of varying depths. A semi-dry layer of cat drool glazed their translucent visors. As the dim yellow light from the porch lamp cast slanted shadows over them, these completely trashed micro-combat suits occasionally popped off faint, short-circuiting sparks. The other 200 feral strays were scattered across the tire stacks flanking the stairs, all staring at him with huge, unblinking eyes, looking exactly like a squad of Marines waiting for their CO to inspect the spoils of war. The toe of old Jim's canvas work shoe brushed past a sprig of foxtail weed poking through the stair gap. His knees popped with the distinct creak of old bones as he crouched down. He raised his rough, rust-stained right hand and unceremoniously poked the roof of the leading microsuit, the one with half its visor bent sideways. His fingertip was instantly coated in a chilly layer of cat spit. The massive one-eared orange tabby instantly shot his tail up like a little pennant. His claw nudged an empty tuna can at his feet, sending it clattering down the steps. All 200-plus feral strays simultaneously craned their necks forward, a low-frequency purring rumbling in their throats. Even the tips of their tails twitched in absolute unison, totally selling the vibe of Marines waiting for a brass commendation. The menthol cigarette clamped in Jim's mouth bobbed. He used his other hand to scratch his oil-stained, graying hair. His cursing voice cut through the frigid Detroit morning breeze. Which little punk from the neighborhood keeps chucking cheap plastic toys onto my turf? These damn cats drag 'em back like they found buried treasure. Suddenly his finger brushed against a faint electrical spark popping out of the suit's seam. The jolt shocked him enough to make him yank his hand back. Flicking away a half strand of cat hair stuck to his fingertip, he tacked on another curse. Shit, the damn thing's even got busted light bulbs in 'em. Kids' junk is getting way too fancy these days. Jim leaned on his heavily calloused knees and stood up. The empty tuna can rolled to a stop, clunking against the rubber toe of his boot. He casually kicked the can into a crevice in the scrap pile below. His eyes scanned to a wide, stiff, bristled broom leaning against the wall behind the door. He reached out and grabbed the polished, dark brown handle, yanking it toward himself. The stiff bristles scraped across the porch planks, catching a few flakes of dried motor oil. Still chewing on the unlit menthol, he slurred his complaints. Little bastards throwing trash on my turf right up to my damn front door. Next time I catch 'em, paddling their asses so hard they won't sit right for 3 days. Gripping the broom handle tightly with both rough hands, one above the other, he dropped his wrists. The stiff broom head pressed flush against the wooden stair planks. With a heavy sweep, he violently shoved the entire row of sparking metal toys sideways. 51 microsuits, riddled with bite marks and plastered in dried cat drool, slid forcefully forward in a chaotic pile. A few leaking suits scraped against a piece of dried wire in the floorboards, shooting off tiny sparks. Along with a couple of dead oak leaves, the whole pile tumbled through the air and dropped straight into the wide-open mouth of a massive black trash can sitting nearby. A week's worth of soggy coffee grounds sitting in the bin took the impact, kicking up a fine, dark brown dust cloud. The drool-coated combat suit sank into the soft, wet muck. Buried dead center beneath his visor, Xerxes' eyelashes suddenly fluttered. The sour, damp stench of rotting coffee grounds violently flooded his respiratory tract through the visor seams, throwing him into a violent coughing fit. Malfunction alarms shrieked inside the sealed cabin. Red error lights strobed at a frequency threatening to burn a hole through the panel. He looked down and saw blue-green rust rapidly creeping across the outer shell of his micro-armor's forearm, corrosion caused by the horrific mixture of cat saliva and waste motor oil. He smashed his knuckles against the comms panel like a madman. A piece of plastic keycap, loosened by a cat's teeth, snapped off and dropped into the gooey coffee grounds, splashing up a tiny fleck of brown sludge. He still had it, the emergency comms module he had smuggled into the inner lining of his suit, in direct violation of military protocol before deployment. It was his absolute last trump card for contacting the mothership. Hands shaking violently, fingers stiffened by the damp coffee grounds, Xerxes pried off the panel cover and brutally jammed the module into the data port. Once the coordinates went out, the mothership's orbital strike fleet would glass this godforsaken blue dirtball within 3 hours max. A sharp, numbing electrical surge instantly shot from his fingertips through his entire body. The soaked coffee grounds, which had spent a week accumulating residual static from a discarded live wire, flooded into the suit's core compartment through the open panel seam. Tiny blue sparks immediately detonated across the circuit boards. He could hear the energy core squealing like a chicken getting its neck wrung. The remaining 11% energy reserve visually plummeted, 10%, 5%, 1%, and finally flatlining to a blinding 0. Buried in the coffee sludge, the other 50 microsuits flashed one final time in unison before every single light, alarm, and monitor died completely in the exact same second. Zerk's Ix didn't even have time to scream his last. Every joint in his armor locked down permanently. Half buried in the squishy coffee grounds, the last ounce of strength required to even lift an eyelid was utterly drained from him. Old Jim leaned the heavy broom against a wooden porch pillar. He snagged a can opener hanging off a nail, its blade chipped and rusted, and violently cracked open the lid of an extra-large can of tuna. Tin shavings sprinkled down into the can as the incredibly pungent, fishy aroma rode the freezing morning breeze, carrying a good 40 feet out. With a flick of his wrist, he dumped the entire slab of oil-soaked tuna meat, juices and all, straight into the dented tin feeding tray at his feet with a loud splat. The big orange tabby, who had been waiting at the bottom of the stairs, pounced first with a loud yowl. His 15 pounds of weight rattled the tin tray against the floor 3 times. His missing left ear lay flat against his fuzz-covered forehead as his thick, long tongue lashed out, instantly sweeping up a sizable chunk of the fattiest meat. A split second later, the other 200 feral strays swarmed out from the scrap crevices and tire stacks, a tidal wave of fur crushing together. The collective purring of their feeding frenzy sounded like a cluster of small engines firing on all cylinders. Sharp claws scraped frantic, shallow grooves into the edge of the tray. Not even the notoriously aggressive Calico gang leader dared to reach a paw into the Orange Titan's territory to steal a scrap. Old Jim kept the unlit menthol clamped in his teeth, leaning his back against the rough wooden beam. The worn-down toe of his work boot absent-mindedly kicked the large black trash can. The heavy plastic walls vibrated with a dull thud. Inside, the damp, half-dry coffee grounds shifted against the fully locked-down micro-combat suits, but not a single spark emerged. Jim popped the tab on an ice-cold beer with a sharp crack that startled 2 sparrows off a nearby roof. The overflowing foam coated his finger, but he didn't bother wiping it off. Breathing in the heavy mix of raw fish and iron rust, he mumbled, his voice raspy as sandpaper on an old crankshaft. "Eat up, boys. Damn fine job. Y'all are the best night security crew in all of Detroit." The very first ray of vibrant orange dawn crested the horizon over the Detroit outskirts, casting a warm glow over the rusted metal carcasses of the 300-acre salvage yard. The orange tabby polished off his final bite of fish, wiped his greasy paw on the leg of Jim's cargo pants, and hopped straight into the old man's lap. The deep, rumbling purr radiating from his throat vibrated hard enough to make a man's calves go numb. That smudge of black motor oil he hadn't quite managed to clean off his forehead glinted in the sunlight, shining like a crooked, hard-earned medal of honor. Deep inside the trash can, a single beam of warm light pierced through the seam of Xerxes's entirely dead visor. This commander of the interstellar infiltration fleet, a man who had conquered 17 galaxies and led an elite force legendary for reducing entire civilizations to ash single-handedly, would never know that his entire squad was wiped off the map in a 300-acre scrapyard on the outskirts of Detroit. And they didn't even score a single kill worthy of the fleet's tactical history books.
Man, can we just appreciate that for a second? These elite galactic commandos rolled up with plasma shields, thinking they'd conquer Earth, only to get absolutely bodied by a Detroit alley cat named Butcher. Hell yeah. The image of a high-tech alien commander getting scooped up like cheap tuna and dumped into soggy coffee grounds is just peak badass comedy. Never underestimate a stray with a bad attitude. So, let me ask you, if a squad of miniature aliens landed in your backyard tonight, what local guard dog or piece of old junk would take them out? Drop your craziest answers in the comments. Smash that like button, subscribe for more hardcore HFY, and see you next time.